Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Najdorf News, in which I keep you up to date with the latest theoretical developments in the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian defence. This variation is denoted by this strange little pawn move a6, a multi-purpose move. Anyway, I don't want to go into too much detail on that at the moment. The game I'm going to feature is between Magnus Carlsen and The World. This was an exhibition game played at the end of November in Mexico. In fact, just before Magnus Carlsen came to London to play in the London Chess Classic. Yeah, it's very interesting actually. In this position, Carlsen had the white pieces, and well, he's played several things against Najdorf, but he tried out this move h3, which we've already encountered in Najdorf News. I featured a game between Alexei Shirov and Arishenko. And h3 is currently very fashionable indeed. Now the idea, of course, is to play a kind of Keres attack by advancing the g-pawn. I don't think h3 is the refutation of the Najdorf. However, it is a tricky move, and well, we should take it seriously. Of course, Fischer sometimes used to play like this. Now, The World were given suggestions by grandmasters in Mexico, and then they voted on the internet for which move they wanted to play. And they played e5 here, which is the principal Najdorf move. Of course, there are many other moves available here, several other moves. I think g6 is a decent move. e6 was actually Carlsen's choice a couple of years ago in the London Chess Classic, and well, I think this is a totally acceptable way for black to play. This was Carlsen's game, and now preempts g5 with knight d7. And well, in this position, I think Carlsen was absolutely fine actually. I like this transfer of the knight to g6, just looking at these squares f4 and h4. This seems to be a very sensible way for black to play. But okay, in this game The World voted for e5, the principal Najdorf move. And now we saw knight b3 in the Shirov-Arishenko game I mentioned previously, but Carlsen went for knight e2. And now I think h5 is somehow I don't know about the best move, but it's the move that I like to play in this position. The idea obviously is to prevent g4. Now it looks very committal to put the pawn to h5, but it's not just about preventing the g-pawn's advance. It's actually about restricting the movement of this knight on e2, because g3 just simply isn't a very inviting square now that the knight will be pushed away. This was actually, h5 was played in the game Anand Nakamura in the London Chess Classic, well, among other games, and they reached a very double-edged position after this continuation. Black has the bishops, but white has control over d5. It's a fairly typical Najdorf position actually. Okay, but instead of h5, The World voted for bishop e7. And now actually I rather like white's position. Carlsen advances with g4 and plays the knight to g3, and yeah, already this is looking rather pleasant for white. Now black's problem here, of course, is how to deal with that wonderful knight on f5 supported by these two pawns. If the knight is taken, then white would recapture with the e-pawn, and you can see now the bishop is on this splendid diagonal, and it also controls these two very important squares, e4 and d5, so it's not really possible for black to use this central pawn majority. And well, you never know, later on there could be a pawn storm on the king side as well. Obviously that is very pleasant for white. So how do you deal with this knight on f5? Well, do you want to advance with g6 to drive away the knight. Well, the problem then is that white will take, and black is left with these very weak dark squares around the king. I mean, that, to me, that looks very ugly indeed. So, yeah, for this reason, I already like white's position. And if I can just take you back to the sixth move, this is actually a known position, a known kind of position, but with white having an extra tempo. Let me just compare and contrast. On the sixth move, g3 is quite a solid variation for white. And if black plays like this, well, you can see the similarities already. This is one of the main lines. And here, white goes for g4, and then knight g3. Well, you can see that white is going to be a tempo behind in this variation, so compared to Carlsen's move. So let's just get to this position. Yeah, you can see that Carlsen has managed to play g4 and reroute this knight very quickly. He's a tempo ahead. So for this reason, I think that the world has already played inaccurately, and I like Carlsen's position. Okay, this is the game continuation. Bishop e6. Okay, black expands on the queen side, as usual in the Najdorf. And here Carlsen played very aggressively indeed. I think perhaps he was somehow given confidence by the world's inaccurate opening, and he played f4 here. I actually like bishop e3 here, and just playing very simply with queen d2 and then probably rook into the middle of the board. And yeah, I think white has a very, very solid advantage there. But Carlsen played extremely aggressively, playing f4. So yeah, just cracking on the king side. Okay, let's see how things developed. Knight a4. Okay, black is trying to open up lines on the queen side. Well, normally a good idea. Okay, Carlsen is still advancing, and now he took on e7 and played for f5. Okay, this was the idea, of course, of advancing the f pawn. Now I have to say I quite like rook f3, with the idea that when black blocks the f pawn, then rook g3, and then I would want to play bishop e3, develop king h2, maybe rook over to the g file, and it seems to me that white has a very natural and automatic attack in this position. But Carlsen went for rook f2, and he chose a different strategy. Now black probably has to block with f6, otherwise the threat of advancing at some point with f6 for white is too dangerous. And now he chose to block the king side. Now of course there are going to be threats of queen h5 sooner or later, or maybe simply taking here. So black closed. But the problem for black is that the king is now in permanent danger. If white ever breaks through on the back rank, of course, the king is in trouble. So Carlsen now developed, okay, his moves are very simple. And now he made room for the rook to come to d1. So very nice play. And now black has something of a dilemma. If he defends this pawn on d6, so for example queen c6, then okay, Carlsen just could build the pressure slowly. I mean, you can see that white's position is kind of a picture of harmony here. There's so much pressure on black's position. So instead of that, instead of waiting, the world chose to enter into great complications, but this allows white a breakthrough, and this is already very double-edged indeed. Well, you can see, well, okay, the basic tactic here is that black's back rank is extremely weak, and this would allow a checkmate. So the world took on a3. That means the knight is covered, so that defends against this back rank threat. But this is a very unpleasant position to deal with. So there are two threats now. Obviously rook d8 mate, and also bishop takes h6, crashing through with the queen. and this is too much for black to deal with. The world tried knight d3, so clearly if the knight is taken, then the rook is en prise. But and if rook takes, well, okay, it looks like white has won material, but actually in this case, that a pawn is just too powerful. Carlsen played rook d7. Now he has played very carefully here, but I think if he negotiates all the tactics, I think he basically has a winning position here. Bishop came back and rook d5, so Carlsen maintaining the pressure on the d file. Knight f4. Okay, this is very tricky. If white takes on f4, then queen b4 is probably a good move, and somehow the back rank is covered and this a pawn could be very dangerous. And what if rook d8 check? Well, the queen comes back to f8, and again black is actually okay in this position, so the a pawn starts to run. So Carlsen has to be very careful here, but he found an excellent move, rook c5. Now this prevents the queen from defending on f8, so for example, rook takes will lead to mate. And yeah, now things are pretty desperate. And rook c7, this sort of threat sets up some nasty, potentially some nasty threats here, but also, well, okay, if black waits, then c4 actually wins the bishop, and if the queen comes back, then bishop c5 actually traps the queen. That's rather nasty, and I think black is basically lost here. c4 is a winning move, and now it's just a case of Carlsen mopping up. Yeah, a2, then queen d7 wins very prosaically, actually, very simple win on the back rank. So, well, this was the end of the game. Now if a2, bishop c3 collects, well, stops the pawn. The game finished like this, and here the world resigned. Carlsen is a piece up, and he's collecting the pawn and driving that one through. So a pretty smooth victory for Carlsen. Now, of course, these kind of internet games where one side is playing by committee, usually, well, often they lead to disaster. But as I said, a very, very nice game from Carlsen. And once again, this fashionable h3 move, which I don't think is anything to worry about if black somehow prevents or contains the move g4, and h5 would be my recommendation. If you're interested in the Najdorf variation, my DVD on the Najdorf is coming out certainly by the end of January, so watch out for that one. And we've got much more to look forward to in January. The Vikonsee tournament is starting on Saturday the 12th of January. There'll be commentary on playchess.com. So do watch out for that. Carlsen is going to be playing along with many of the top players in the world. Thanks very much for watching, and I wish you a very happy new year.